equipping you to navigate your grief journey after child loss. This is the Hope After Child Loss podcast. On each episode, we explore the many challenges of grief as guests share their stories of loss. It's also a place where you will hear about God showing up in our darkest moments and restoring meaning, purpose, and hope to shattered lives. Welcome to another episode of the Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Greg Buffkin, and I'm so glad you could join us today. I'll be talking today with my friend Dr. Allan MacDonald about his son Josh and the grief journey he's been on since losing Josh in December of 2018 to some lifelong medical complications. Now here's my conversation with Allan. Allan, welcome to our podcast today. It's really great to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. For our listeners, Allan and I are good friends. We've known each other for a while now. We are members of the same church here in South Carolina, and we're actually in a small group together. And so we're very familiar with each other's stories. But I would like for you, Allan, just to spend the first couple of minutes or so just telling us a little bit about you and what your life is about today, and then we'll kind of dive into your story.
Well, I'm close to retirement age. I'm a family physician here in South Carolina teaching in a residency program. So I'm surrounded by young people my whole life. I now live alone and worshiping at the same church as Greg. I'm here and I've been through some losses.
Yeah, you have. You definitely have. And we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about the loss, but we'll also talk about some of the other aspects of grief that you have encountered on your grief journey. And we'll talk about some of the healing aspects of your journey as well that God's done in your life. So, Allan, your grief journey really didn't begin in December of 2018 when Josh died. I know in previous conversations you've shared how your grief journey actually started not long after Josh was born, and you guys got a diagnosis that no parent wants to hear. Take us back and tell us a little bit about that part of it.
Sure. Josh was the third of our three children, our third boy, and we had a very difficult time having children. And Josh was a surprise, and everything was going fine with his pregnancy until the day he was born, when he was born with obvious and some not so obvious deformities and problems. And he ended up with a genetic problem that's very rare called Carpenter's syndrome. He was born with all the bones fused together in his skull, and we were told that he'd never experienced anything, that he had no thinking brain. It was all going to be spinal reflexes. Long story short, he went through 11 surgeries before he was 7 years old, and the most serious of which was he had a very severe heart defect called pulmonary atresia, and he needed 3 heart surgeries to basically survive. And he did very well. He lived 26 years. He learned how to play a two-handed piano, which I can't do, and
Wow.
was the head usher at our church, and was ziplining with oxygen tanks, and he was just an amazing kid who did all kinds of stuff that people said he'd never do. And that's the amazing part of Josh.
Wow. So he defied quite a few odds, didn't he?
We were told very early we were getting discouraged with what people were saying he would never do. He'd never do this, he'd never do this. And then he ended up doing stuff. And this was when he was an infant. And finally, his pediatrician said, Allan, don't let other people tell you what Josh won't do. You let Josh tell you what he can do. And that was his motto. We told him that, and he lived by that. And I remember one day he was in his early 20s with an oxygen tank, and he wanted to go down a zip line. And he really wanted to do it. And I said, Josh, I just don't know if you can do that. You've got oxygen. He's put his hands on his hips. And he said, Dad, don't tell me what I can't do. I'll tell you what I can do. And he went down the zip line. And it was, I mean, that was Josh.
It's a good thing Josh didn't listen to all of his doctors, isn't it?
Especially his daddy.
I was getting ready to say, including his dad. That is funny. It reminds me of one of our favorite phrases, "but God."
That's right.
Yeah. Allan, not a lot of parents, I mean, too many, but so many of us don't really have to watch our child go through a journey like that. And not many of us experience grief for that number of years. I mean, that's a long time, because Josh was 26. As his dad, how did you really start to process and navigate? I can't imagine you guys had to do from the very beginning. I mean, how do you do that?
Well, at first, I mean, everything was doom and gloom. And so the day he was born, we began this grief. And I remember he had just been born. He was lying butt naked on the baby warmer, and just stroking his little bum and just crying and crying and crying with this kid that had so many problems. And this wonderful nurse, who was the nursery nurse, probably in her 50s then, and she was a Christian, and she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "Allan, God's got this, and this is a special kid." And we just had to say that this was part of God's plan. We saw as Josh grew and got older, he developed his own personality and was able to do stuff, and was just a sweet, fun, happy kid. He got stuck at 5th grade. That was the best he could do. But he was just a sweet kid with all kinds of life. The problem was, as he got older, he developed pulmonary hypertension, and both sides of his heart started to fail. And we could see him getting weaker and weaker and more short of breath, and wanted to do things but didn't have the stamina. And I remember a year before he died thinking, we don't have much longer with him. That was, and I could see it. I don't think my wife wanted to believe it. I didn't want to believe it, but I just saw that it was he wasn't going to live near as long as anybody wanted him to.
Yeah, and knowing what the prognosis was from the outset, and not knowing how many days he did have, other than what you guys had been told, I would imagine in some respects that does impact the way that you would see life on a daily basis. I think God designed us such that he wanted us to live our lives one day at a time, because none of us are promised tomorrow, let alone, Josh. But I think a lot of times we take so much for granted. We think that we're going to have a lifetime with our kids, me included. But, a lot of us don't have that prognosis hanging over our heads. But you guys did. But I can imagine that probably gave you the perspective of trying to live and make the most of every day, not knowing what tomorrow was going to bring.
Yeah, it was like living with a terminal illness. I mean, and we did everything we could to help Josh be as normal as he could. And because he was intellectually delayed, his chronological age friends all grew up and surpassed him. And that was difficult, and we tried to do things to help him feel included. And one thing he really latched onto was there was a bunch of guys ushering at church. They kind of adopted him and made him their honorary head usher, and he was at church every Sunday ushering, and he just loved it, and it was a way for him to feel included. His older brother, Eddie, is 3 years older than he was, and they were absolute best friends, and the two of them just did stuff together. That was really good for Josh to have such a really strong buddy for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Allan, how would you say, and when you think back to to the earliest days, and then over the past 6 years, how has your relationship with the Lord and your faith been affected by what you've been through?
I had to cling. I there were days when I'd shake my fist at God, and there were days when I'd just say, I just don't know what to do. We would sit with him in the intensive care unit after open heart surgery 3 times. And it was just one day at a time. And, he would get sick. And when Josh got sick, it wasn't like he just got a cold. He'd get sick. And we just have to cry out to God. And I just learned to just rely on him and lean on him.
Yeah. Was there anything that you learned about him, God, in all of this that you thought that you knew before, but discovered that you didn't know in the middle of all of this?
I think when Josh died, I was there. He died in my arms.
Yeah.
He had a cardiac arrest, and I was in the room next to him when it happened, and I did CPR and on my own child, and then the police came with a defibrillator and defibrillated him. And he was taken to the hospital, and he lived 2 weeks, and I spent all that time with him in the hospital. And we decided he didn't want to have CPR again, and he just said, no more, it hurts, I don't want to do it again. And then one night he went to bed and his heart stopped, and I told the nurses no. And he just passed away in my arms. And I had to lean on God that whole time. We don't expect to die after our kids do. Yeah, we don't expect to outlive our kids.
No, we don't.
Even with Josh, we knew sometime would come, but somehow we didn't think sometime would be there.
Yeah. No, I understand that. That's a hard thing to come to terms with, is, when you do find yourself in a place where you have outlived your child. It's not the natural order of things from our human perspective. And we don't come with an instruction booklet that tells us, how to walk through that. We certainly, as believers, know what God has said about death and about life in his word. But as parents, we don't approach that with any type of understanding about how we process and how we're supposed to process and walk through that.
No, and our marriage didn't survive Joshua's death. And, in the course of 9 months, my mother died, my son died, and my wife and I split up. And so, I went through a huge grieving process, not just losing Josh, but kind of life just turning upside down.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So but through that, I just became closer and closer to the Lord. I've heard there's a prayer, the I don't know prayer. Lord, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on, but you know. And I was doing a lot of that. I don't know. I just don't know, but you do.
And that's okay, because sometimes that's all you got.
Yeah.
And he understands that.
Yeah. And when Josh died, the church was full. We were going to a pretty big church nearby, and the church was absolutely packed for his funeral. And it was a rainy day, and my son and I were pallbearers for him, and we carried him out to the hearse at the end of the funeral, and it was pouring rain. And one of my residents, I have all these family medicine residents. One of my residents came out with an umbrella to hold over my head, and then all the residents, like 25, 30 residents, came out and wanted to shake my hand and hug me, and it was really cool the way people came around us at that time. And
I can only imagine what that meant to you.
Yeah, a lot of people loved him.
Yeah, it sounds like he was very well loved and still is.
Yeah.
I think we all know that the death of a child just so profoundly affects us as parents, but so does our child's life. Why don't you just talk a little bit about how Josh's life impacted your life?
I keep saying he was a sweet kid. He was a 26-year-old. He was a 5th grader in a 26-year-old body, but he was full of life. Couldn't ride a bicycle, but he could ride a tricycle. So his brother, for Christmas, bought him an adult tricycle.
Really?
It was, really a super idea and just really generous thing. But so he could ride his trike, and we would go to the beach, and he couldn't go for long walks, but he would go for walks on the beach, and we would ride bikes on the beach, and his either pull him behind in one of those rickshaw things until he got too big to do that, or else he'd also go out on the tricycle. Taught him how to shoot. He hunted. Something I'd never done. He got a buck and a doe with a 410 shotgun.
What?
He sure did.
Wow.
And I mean, he just, what I learned was you can do whatever you want to do if you want to do it. Don't let people say no. And so he loved Clemson football. He loved Major League Baseball. He'd stand in front of the TV. This kid with oxygen who should have been sitting down, stand in front of the TV for hours watching a baseball game or watching a football game. He got to meet Dabo Sweeney, the coach for the Clemson Tigers. And
how cool.
Dabo gave us 2 footballs for Josh. He just really he was the Clemson Fan of the Year one year for our area in South Carolina. He was just one of those kids that he made people smile. And you could look at Josh and say, he's an odd-looking kid, but then you'd look at Josh and say, there's something really cool. He was in an odd-looking package, but he was Josh. And once you got to know him, you just loved him. He was such a sweet kid.
Wow. It sounds like he touched a lot of lives, and he packed an awful lot of living into those 26 years.
He sure did. He really did.
And how cool that he has a dad who was willing to take the time, to make the time, even though a busy physician often doesn't have that ability.
He liked to play backgammon. He could beat me in backgammon. And we'd do board games. I mean, he didn't have a lot of physical stamina. So we'd do board games, or he'd sit and snuggle up to me next to me on the couch, and we'd watch a movie or watch a ball game together. And he was my buddy. He really was.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys had a really special relationship. And so I guess I got to ask you too, so when you were in medical school, did you not take the backgammon course that was offered as an extra credit?
A college friend taught me how, but he could beat the pants off me too, and we would bet pizza, and I was always buying pizza for him. But I taught Josh how to play backgammon. He would play it with himself on a computer if he didn't have anybody to play with, but we'd play together on a big backgammon board. He got real good at it.
That is very cool. Allan, I want to talk about something that is misunderstood by people who are looking in and observing our lives after we've lost a child. They see the emotional impact. They hear it in our voice. They see our faces. And so they know that it's hard. But I think what they often miss is the impact that it has on parents physically and mentally and spiritually. So for you, what would you say was the most difficult aspect of that for you over the past 6 years?
I think the emotional toll was the hardest, but I learned in my grieving process. Fortunately, I was working with a mentor. I started working with him about 2 months before Josh died and stayed with him for another 1.5 years. And he walked me through the grieving process. And one of the things he taught me was he called it pulsing gratitude and pulsing joy and pulsing peace.
Yeah.
And it was, and when I would think of Josh, those first few weeks when it was so hard, I'd think of Josh just walking down the hallway in the hospital, trying to get a normal life again and trying to get back into teaching and seeing patients. And I'd think of Josh and I'd start to cry inside or even just cry right there. And I would I'd think of something joyful about Josh and just be thankful for what I had with him. And that really helped to get through that really difficult emotional time. And then, as my wife and I split up 3 months after he died, that made it even more difficult. But I was able to count it all joy.
And I'm sure that was an everyday, multiple times during the day decision.
It was, and it was a decision. I would have to choose to be joyful. The waves of grief would hit me, and I also learned the wave's going to hit me, and if you're next to me when this wave hits me, we're going for a ride. And then I learned how to swim. And I learned how to swim through the waves. I'd swim over the waves. I'd see a wave coming and say, okay, there's peace on the other side. And so I just ride these waves now. I still get them. I still get waves of grief. I was thinking about this interview yesterday, and I started crying. It's okay. I'm comfortable with that.
Well, I think what you're saying to parents that are listening today who might be in an even fresher season of grief than either of us, you really stress the importance of leaning into the grief. Because you're going to feel those emotions. You are going to get hit by those waves that sometimes just come from out of nowhere. It's almost like getting T-boned driving down the road. You just don't see it coming. Instead of trying to deny it, instead of trying to bury yourself in work or whatever it might be, if you'll lean into it, as hard as it is and as painful as it is, it will help in the healing process. Because if you don't now, at some point in the future, it will emerge in some way, shape, or form. And generally, it's not in a very healthy way. Would you agree?
Yeah, and absolutely. And going back to the wave thing, I mean, you could if I see a wave coming, if I run away from it, it's going to hit me. But if I swim into it, lean into it, I'll get through it. I can either go through it or over it. But I lean into it. I just face it head on. But I'll get knocked over if I try to walk away from it.
Yeah. And what you're describing, facing that wave, going through it or over it, again, we're talking about making mental choices and decisions instead of being ruled by the emotion that makes us sometimes want to curl up in a fetal position. But when you make that choice, as you just shared, you will get through it, or you will go over it, because nobody can escape it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had another person explain there's a difference between getting through and getting over. I'll never get over the fact that Josh died. I will get through the fact that Josh died. And it's part of my life history now. And I choose to focus on how much we had with Josh. And, I miss him. I miss him terribly. I wish he were here right now.
Of course.
I also look forward to when I'll be able to see him again. And we have
absolutely.
We have that hope as Christians. And he was a believer. It's just going to be a time, and then we'll be moving further in and farther up, as whatever C.S. Lewis said, when we see each other in heaven.
Yeah. For people that are listening today that maybe don't have that assurance, we would want them to have what we have. It's not that we don't grieve. It's not that we don't experience suffering and pain in our lives as followers of Jesus. But what we do have is Him to go through those things with us. We don't have to carry it by ourselves. That was not God's original intention until, sin entered into the world because of us. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Allan. The other thing that, that I wanted to ask you about was, so when you look back over the last 6 years, what do you wish that people on the outside understood better about what it is you've been experiencing and going through since losing Josh?
I think one of the things, I want to be free to be able to talk about Josh without making other people uncomfortable.
So how do we do that?
Yeah, I just talk about him.
Good.
And when I talk about him, I don't get all maudlin or don't, but I just talk about him in grateful, thankful terms. Or, Josh used to do this, or Josh loved this or something. I want people to not worry that talking about Josh with me is going to make me sad. It may.
Yeah.
But so what?
Yeah.
If it makes me sad, we'll deal with it. But I don't want Josh to go away because he's a taboo subject. He needs to be part of the conversation. He's still part of my family. He's just,
of course,
but he's part of the family.
Yeah, and probably like us, we talk about Ryan in the present tense because Ryan's much more alive now than he was when he was here. And like you, we don't want people to forget about him. So yeah, we love to talk about him. And I think one of the things that people fear or get anxious about is they think that they're going to remind us that we lost our child if we bring it up.
Right.
Well, We didn't forget.
We want to talk about him. I want people to know who knew Josh to be able to talk about him, and people who didn't know Josh to be able to find out about him.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about Ryan now, this month was 9 years ago. We can laugh about Ryan now. We laugh about the funny things that he did. His sister Whitney loves to tell stories on Ryan that sometimes we're just finding out about quite a few years later. And we can laugh as though he was right there in the room with us, because he would be laughing louder than the rest of us. But it takes a while to get there, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
The first few months were just trying to keep my head above those waves.
Yeah. Been there and done that. I know that it's a very difficult thing to do. But as we move forward, a day at a time, it's just really cool how God allows those sweet, fun, and funny memories to become greater and more in quantity than the sad memories.
And his first birthday, the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, the first, all those anniversaries, the year he died, or the anniversary of the year he died, those were all very difficult. But now I just, like on his birthday, Josh loved calzones at Mellow Mushroom. So on his birthday, I go to Mellow Mushroom and have a beer and a calzone. He loved Yingling, so if I can get a Yingling, I'll have a Yingling. And then he loved paddling, so one of the first time I went down Lynch's River, which is one of our local rivers, in a canoe, was with him the first time. So on his birthday, which is in August, I try to go paddling and just kind of be on the water with him. So I do those things to help with the anniversaries.
Yeah, there's wisdom in that. For somebody who hasn't experienced what we have, they might find that a bit odd, but we do the same kinds of things, Allan. And invariably, most all of the guests that I talk to express something very similar to that. It's something that means a lot to us, and it doesn't, nobody else really needs to understand that. When you find yourself in that position, the things that might seem logical or illogical to you outside of those circumstances, it makes every bit of sense to us, and we do it unapologetically.
On the first year anniversary, he died New Year's Eve at night. The first year anniversary, I decided I'm going to go to his favorite restaurant. So I went, it's here in Florence, and I asked for a table in the corner. I told the greeter that I was feeling kind of contemplative. So she put me at a table in the corner, and then she was going to take the second place setting away. I said, you know what? Why don't you leave that?
Okay.
Why don't you leave it? See, it happens. This is normal.
It is. So
there's a little wave that hit me, and now, okay, I'm good.
Yeah. Thank you for being transparent.
Yeah.
I think that helps people that are listening to know that it's real, and another one of those waves that you didn't anticipate.
Every once in a while, a rogue wave will come out of nowhere and really knock me.
Allan, I think sometimes for dads who lose a child, I don't know about you, but one of the hardest things for me to do in the aftermath was to even think about going back to work and facing all those people, some who knew what had happened, some who didn't, and having to relive that, so to speak, for days and weeks and months before it was not fresh on everybody's mind any longer. What was that like for you? Because, as you told our listeners early on in the conversation, you're a family doctor in a very large regional medical center here in South Carolina. And not only do you see patients, but you also help teach the residents. So you had to go back and face people, and you also had to go back into life and death situations with patients. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigated that whole process of going back to work and having to interact with people on that basis?
Yeah, I work for a large regional health center here, and they were very good. They gave me a couple of weeks, I think, of bereavement time that didn't count against PTO. It was just say, listen, we give this to everybody. They were really good about that. And, family doctors are family people. And so My colleagues were really good. The residents were really good. The residents were Josh's age. They gave me space, but I had to come back and start teaching and seeing patients. And the other thing was Josh died at our hospital. There was a time when I had to round on a patient in the room that Josh died, and that was difficult until I could say, listen, I'm going to bring Joshua's joy back into this room. And so in bringing my grief in, I brought his joy. It's hard to get back to work, but fortunately, my people were so gracious and kind and patient. They just kind of let me kind of slide back into work at my own pace. Every day, walking in the same hospital that he died in. That was hard, and it was hard to walk on the floor. And then again, that first time I had to see somebody in the room, especially hard. By God's grace, that didn't happen until he'd been dead for a year. God kept me out of that room.
Wow.
That was grace.
Allan, do you think that you are a better person today than you were the day before Josh died?
Yes. I've learned to lean on God more, and I'm still learning. I mean, I'm far from the person he wants me to be.
Congratulations. You're like the rest of us.
Right. And he won't call me home until he's done with me. Somebody used to say, please be patient. God is not finished with me yet.
What does that new 2.0 version of Allan look like? How are you different?
I think I'm more joyful. And through the whole grieving process, not just of losing Josh, but losing a marriage, I think I'm worshiping in a different place physically and spiritually. I think that's something I've learned to embrace. Joy in the things I like to do, the people I like to be with. I still love teaching and having 27 residents is having 27 kids. Sometimes I feel like the old curmudgeon, and sometimes it's like, oh, this is going really well, and I really, these are really great kids, and they're going to make me proud when they finish their residency here.
Yeah, at least you don't have to take them home with them and look after them.
Sometimes I feel like a junior high principal.
I can imagine, because they're still young, right?
They are young, and they're getting younger and younger and younger, but they're right at the age where Josh was when he died, which is kind of cool. So, I'm teaching young people, young adults, who it's sort of like helping finish off with Josh or helping complete the process.
Yeah.
Times a year.
What a great perspective.
Yeah.
I love that.
I'd never thought of that before. That's cool.
Yeah. Allan, before we go, there's something that I'd like for you to talk about when we think about the people that are listening today. They're in a variety of different places on their grief journey. And as men, I think we have a much more difficult time being able to process our emotions. And sometimes we just don't know what to do with our emotions. We don't know how to verbalize it. And we are much more reticent to share with other people unless they are just super close and you can absolutely trust them. And even then it's hard. I guess it's just the way we are, unfortunately, mighty hard-headed sometimes as men. What would you want to say to a grieving dad who's listening today, who's wondering, how he's going to survive all of this? He's still got all of his responsibilities. He's got other relationships. Sometimes we go into protective mode as dads and husbands and neglect ourselves. What would you say to that guy today?
I would say, first of all, don't be afraid of your emotions. They are what they are. And when you're sad, you're sad. When you're mad, you're mad. And don't be afraid of being mad. The other thing is, I have shaken my fist at God many times, and he has not killed me. He still loves me.
Yes.
Come out of the sky. So don't be afraid to be mad at God. I would certainly really encourage men to find somebody they can talk to, either their spouse or another, like a really close friend. One of the elders at church or somebody at church, or a counselor. I use mentor counselors. I've worked with them throughout my life, but they were particularly helpful around the time Josh died and thereafter. And the other thing is stay physically active. Just take care of yourself. Make sure you sleep. At least you're lying down. If you're having trouble sleeping, a doctor can help you with sleep if that's an issue. To keep moving.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And the only other thing that I might add to that, Allan, is sometimes grief, particularly the grief that where people often get stuck. That's how we talk about it. Prolonged grief disorder is a very real mental health disorder. Sometimes grief and depression look a lot alike. If you've got somebody else, like Allan was just talking about in your life, who can speak the truth in love, if you feel like you're stuck, you may be experiencing clinical depression, and that makes it all that much more important to see either or both a professional counselor and a family physician.
To make a plug for family physicians are good listeners. And that's really what you need, is someone to listen and someone to help be outside your box, who can look in and say, yeah, maybe we need to take a different approach. Don't let grief overcome you and become a clinical problem.
Absolutely. There is no shame whatsoever in going to get professional help. I mean, we do it for a lot of other challenges in our lives. Sometimes we need a professional painter, or we need a professional builder, and we don't think twice about that. Well, sometimes as guys we do. We think that we can do everything ourselves. Tim, the tool man Taylor, But, we cannot be experts on everything. And sometimes we have a very deceptive view of our own condition at times. So let other people in.
Absolutely. I sought counseling almost preemptively. So I was working with somebody before Josh died, and we just continued. And that was, I didn't need medication or anything like that. We just worked through it. And
right.
It was two guys. It was iron sharpening iron. And this guy, he would call a spade, and he would call my bluff. He would say, really? And he would make me be honest with myself. And it really helped me process in a healthy way, to the point where I feel comfortable with my grief now. It hurts, but I feel comfortable with it.
Yeah. It becomes just an aspect of your daily living. It's not something, as you said earlier, that you ever get over. You learn to live with it,
right,
and live through it. Allan, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad that you were able to carve time out of that schedule to come and join us today. And I so appreciate your honesty and transparency. I think it makes people that are listening feel more comfortable when we can connect at a heart level like that. And we don't try to hide what we're actually suggesting that they do. It's been an honor to have you. And I appreciate your friendship as well.
Me too. We'll have lunch together again soon.
I'll be looking forward to it. Thank you, Allan. Well, thank you for joining us today. If you would like to offer your thoughts on today's episode, simply click the link under the episode summary. And if you're interested in sharing your story on a future episode, email us using the provided link. Join us again in 2 weeks to hear another story of how God meets us in our pain, creates something beautiful from the broken pieces, and restores meaning, purpose, and hope.